At 08:17 on March 21, 1945, three Japanese Zero fighters dove straight into the side of an American carrier off Okinawa. Two exploded in mid-air before they reached the deck. Black smoke and twisted metal tumbled into the sea. The third pilot made it through the flak, through the tracers, through the wall of fire that turned the sky into a grid of red lines, and slammed his bomb into the flight deck at 400 kilometers per hour. The explosion tore a hole 3 meters wide. Fire spread across 10 meters of deck plating. 8 men died in the first 5 seconds. 14 more were wounded. Damage control teams sprinted across the deck with hoses and foam canisters. 11 minutes later, the fire was out. 4 hours after that, the carrier was launching planes again. 3 pilots dead. 8 enemy sailors killed. 1 small hole. The ship kept moving. Masaru Takeda watched that attack from 11,000 meters above, flying escort in a conventional Zero. He counted the black bursts that surrounded the diving planes. He watched the American fighters peel off from their combat air patrol and shred the stragglers who hesitated or turned too early. He watched one kamikaze pull up at the last second in panic and get cut in half by a wall of 20mm shells from a destroyer. When the formation turned back toward base, 2 of the escort fighters were gone, and none of the 3 kamikaze had survived. On the flight back, Takeda's radio stayed silent. Nobody spoke. There was nothing useful to say. At the debriefing, an officer with a clean uniform and a clipboard asked the escort pilots if the attackers had shown proper spirit. Takeda said yes, because any other answer would have been called defeatism. The officer nodded and made a note. Then he said the next mission would be larger. More planes, better results. Takeda did not ask how sending more pilots on the same path into the same guns would produce a different outcome. He had learned that questions like that were not welcome. 2 days later, his squadron leader called him into a side office and told him he was being transferred. Special Attack Corps, 8th Kamikaze Unit, Coastal Airfield, report by April 5th. Takeda stood at attention and said he understood. The squadron leader looked at him for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, then changed his mind and handed him the transfer papers. When Takeda left the office, his hands were steady, but his stomach felt like it had been filled with cold water. Outside the barracks that night, he knelt behind a stack of fuel drums and vomited onto the dirt. The ground there already smelled sour. Other men had done the same. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stayed there in the dark for a long time, listening to the distant sound of engines being tested on the flight line. He was 24 years old. Before the war, he had wanted to design bridges. On April 7, 1945, at 06:42 in the morning, he walked out onto the wet concrete of the new airfield and joined the line of men who had 2 weeks or less to live. The wind off the Pacific smelled of fuel and salt. A row of Zero fighters waited along the runway, green paint faded and patched, white identification bands painted in uneven strokes around the fuselage. Ground crews moved between them in silence, pushing bomb carts, checking fuel lines, tightening bolts on racks that had been welded on in the last few days. Nobody joked, nobody sang. Everyone knew what kind of unit this was. Takeda stopped in front of his assigned aircraft. The Zero looked older than the ones he had flown before. The paint was worn through in places down to bare metal. One aileron had a patch riveted over a hole. Under the fuselage hung a single bomb bigger than anything he had ever carried, bolted to a crude steel rack that looked like it had been hammered together in a workshop. The mounting points were visibly bent from the weight. A mechanic in oil-stained coveralls checked the final fittings without looking up. His hands moved quickly, but his face was blank. Yesterday, this man had prepared 6 planes. None of them had come back. Takeda asked if the bomb release worked properly. The mechanic nodded once and said it had been tested on the ground. Then he added quietly that it did not matter much since nobody planned to release it in the air anyway. He walked away before Takeda could reply. Inside the ready room, an officer stood in front of a chalkboard covered with diagrams and scribbly notations. The pilots sat on benches in 2 rows. Some were older men like Takeda, pulled from regular units. Most were boys just out of training, faces smooth and young, eyes too wide. The officer tapped the board with a wooden pointer. American carrier group detected south of Kyushu. 3 flat tops, heavy destroyer screen. Expected fighter cover at least 30 planes. Radar confirmed. He traced a line from the airfield to a rough sketch of ships arranged in a defensive circle. Approach at 3,000 meters in tight formation. At 10 kilometers from target, begin descent. Full throttle. No evasive action. Select nearest carrier. Aim for center of flight deck. Impact at maximum speed. The pointer stopped on the diagram. No secondary targets. No return flight plan. One of the younger pilots raised his hand and asked what to do if the first carrier was too damaged to reach. The officer said to aim for the second carrier. If that was not possible, aim for any large ship. If no large ship was available, aim for the escort screen. The priority was to hit something. The boy nodded as if this made sense. Takeda looked at the diagram and thought about the attack he had watched 2 weeks earlier. The manual approach, the predictable dive angle, the wall of flak that had shredded 2 planes before they got within a kilometer of their target. He thought about how American radar picked up formations long before human eyes could see them, how their fighters had time to climb and position themselves perfectly, how their gunners knew exactly where to aim because every attack came from the same direction at the same angle. The officer finished the briefing and told them they had 30 minutes to prepare. Write letters, check equipment, make peace. The chaplain arrived and spoke brief words about sacrifice and duty. Each pilot stepped forward to receive a white headband with a red sun in the center. When Takeda tied his on, the cloth smelled faintly of incense and someone else's sweat. The man who had worn it before him was already gone. They were given paper and pens for final letters. Takeda sat at a rough wooden table and stared at the blank sheet for a long time. Around him, other men wrote quickly, filling page after page. One boy was crying silently as he wrote, tears dripping onto the paper and smudging the ink. Takeda wrote 3 short lines. Father, Mother, I am ordered to attack the enemy as I was trained. I do not know what will happen. Forgive me. He did not write that he thought the plan was a waste. He did not write that he intended to find another way if he could. He folded the letter and handed it to the clerk, whose job was to sort the last messages of men who would not return. The clerk's face showed nothing. He had done this 40 times in the past 2 weeks. Outside, engines began to start one by one. The deep roar of radial motors shook the walls. The smell of exhaust and burning oil drifted into the room. Someone called the pilots to their aircraft. Takeda walked across the concrete toward his Zero. The other pilots moved in a loose group, some walking stiffly, some too fast, one boy adjusting his headband 3 times in 10 meters. The ground crew stood aside and watched them pass without speaking. At his plane, Takeda paused under the wing. The bomb casing was cold and rough under his fingertips. He imagined its weight dragging on the airframe, changing the way the controls would respond, slowing the turns, making the dive steeper and harder to control. He pictured the American ships turning hard, guns tracking, every second of approach lit by muzzle flashes. The mechanic reappeared with a rag in his hands and pretended to check something on the landing gear. He did not look at Takeda. After a moment, he said, very quietly, that the fuel tank was full and the engine had been inspected twice. Then he added that the plane would fly well if the pilot knew what he was doing. Takeda met his eyes for a brief second. The man's expression was carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight. He turned and walked away without saying anything else. Takeda climbed into the cockpit and strapped himself in. The seat felt harder than usual. The instrument panel was scuffed and worn. Someone had scratched a small mark into the edge of the throttle quadrant, a single vertical line like a tally. He wondered how many missions this plane had flown and who had scratched that mark. He ran through the startup checklist. Fuel selector, mixture rich, throttle cracked, magnetos on. He pressed the starter. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, then caught and settled into a lumpy idle. Vibration traveled up through the seat into his spine. He advanced the throttle slightly and the note deepened. The radio crackled. Squadron leader's voice, clipped and formal. All aircraft prepare for departure. Formation diamond. Maintain 3,000 meters. Attack approaches briefed. Acknowledge. One by one, the pilots answered. Takeda keyed his microphone and said he understood. The first pair of Zeros rolled forward, gathered speed, lifted off, then the next pair. The runway shrank as each group took to the air. When his turn came, Takeda released the brakes, pushed the throttle to full, and felt the heavy plane lurch forward. The bomb dragged on the airframe. The acceleration was slower than he was used to. The nose wanted to stay down. At the right speed, he eased back on the stick. The wheels left the ground. The airfield dropped away. Trees and low buildings blurred past. He raised the landing gear and felt the drag reduce slightly. Ahead, the other Zeros were forming up in a loose diamond, their wings rocking as pilots adjusted spacing. Takeda climbed and slid into position on the left side of the formation. Through the canopy, he could see the leader's aircraft 100 meters ahead, bomb hanging underneath like a dark egg. To his right, another Zero flew with visible effort, the pilot's head moving side to side as he struggled to hold formation. The altimeter needle crept upward, 1,000 meters, 2,000. The land below became a patchwork of fields and roads. The coastline appeared, a ragged edge where brown earth met gray sea. Beyond that, nothing but water stretching to the horizon. The formation flew east. Takeda scanned the sky out of habit. No enemy fighters yet. The air was cold and clear. Visibility good, too good. That meant the enemy radar would see them from a long way out. He looked down and to the right. A broken layer of low clouds hung 1,000 meters below the formation, scattered and uneven. Patches of shadow moved across the water where the clouds blocked the sun. Below that layer, the air would be darker, harder to see into, and the radar return would be confused by the sea surface clutter. The radio came alive again. Leader's voice: target bearing 095, range 80 kilometers, maintain course and altitude, prepare for attack run in 10 minutes. Takeda's hand rested on the throttle. His eyes tracked the distant line of clouds. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the American task force was moving, radar dish spinning, fighters already climbing to intercept, gunners loading ammunition and checking ranges. If we come in where they expect us, he thought, they will start killing us 15 kilometers out. He looked at the formation around him. 12 Zeros. 12 bombs, 12 men flying straight toward a plan that had failed every time he had seen it tried. The leader's plane held steady at 3,000 meters, exactly where the briefing had specified. Takeda's jaw tightened, his fingers curled around the control stick. He did not yet know exactly when he would break formation. He only knew that when the moment came, he would not follow the straight line into the guns. He would find another way. Or he would die trying something different. Either way, he would not waste his life on a plan drawn by men who had never flown into enemy fire. At 09:03 on April 7, 1945, the American radar operator on the destroyer USS Cassin Young marked 12 contacts inbound at 3,000 meters range, 72 kilometers bearing 270. He called it up to the Combat Information Center. The officer on duty checked the plot, confirmed hostile, and sounded general quarters across the task force. On the carrier, USS Intrepid deck crew scrambled. Fighters that had been idling on the catapults went to full power and launched in pairs every 40 seconds. Within 3 minutes, 8 Hellcats were climbing through 2,000 meters heading west. The Combat Air Patrol Coordinator gave them vectors and altitude. Intercept inbound hostiles, weapons free. Takeda heard none of this, but he knew it was happening. He had flown enough missions to understand how American carriers worked. Radar sees you, fighters launch, guns track. By the time you get close, the sky is full of tracers, and the interceptors are positioned above and behind you where your gunner cannot see them. The formation of 12 Zeros flew east at 3,000 meters in tight diamond. The leader's voice came over the radio, calm and formal. Target bearing 092, range 60 kilometers. All aircraft maintain formation and altitude. Prepare for attack descent in 6 minutes. Takeda's eyes moved between his instruments and the sky ahead. Airspeed 240 kilometers per hour. Engine temperature normal. Fuel sufficient. The bomb under his fuselage pulled the nose down slightly. He trimmed the controls to compensate. Around him, the other Zeros held position, their wings rocking gently in the turbulence. Below and to his right, the scattered cloud layer stretched across the water like torn fabric. The gaps between clouds showed dark blue sea. The clouds themselves were low and ragged, maybe 800 meters above the surface. Visibility underneath them would be poor. Radar return weak. The Americans would be looking up at the expected altitude, not down into the clutter near the waves. He scanned the horizon. No sign of enemy fighters yet, but they were out there, climbing, positioning. waiting for the perfect angle to dive on the formation from above and behind. Takeda's hand rested on the throttle. His mind ran through the sequence of what was supposed to happen. In 4 minutes, the leader would give the order to descend. The formation would push over into a shallow dive, staying together, maintaining the diamond pattern. They would accelerate toward the target at full throttle. At 15 kilometers, the first flak bursts would appear. At 10 kilometers, the fighters would hit them. At 5 kilometers, the close-in guns would open up. If anyone made it through all that, they would pick a target and dive straight down into it, carrying the bomb all the way to impact. The manual said this was the most effective method. The manual had been written by men who did not fly the missions. He looked at the other pilots around him. The Zero to his right was flown by a boy who looked 19 at most. His head kept turning left and right as if searching for something. Nerves. The plane on the far left wobbled slightly, the pilot overcorrecting. Inexperience. These men had maybe 30 hours in a cockpit. They would do exactly what the leader told them to do because they did not know any other way. Takeda had 300 hours and 6 combat missions. He knew other ways. The radio crackled. Leader's voice. All aircraft check in. Confirm weapons armed and ready. One by one, the pilots responded. Takeda keyed his microphone and said his bomb was armed. It was not a lie. The fuse had been set before takeoff. If the plane hit anything solid at high speed, the bomb would detonate. He checked his fuel again. Enough for 40 minutes at cruise power or 20 minutes at full throttle. No reserve for a return flight. The planners had not included one. Far ahead on the horizon, a thin, dark line appeared. Smoke, ships, the American task force. Even at this distance, he could make out the shapes. 3 large flat profiles, carriers, smaller shapes scattered around them, destroyers and cruisers. The formation was spread out in a defensive wheel, the carriers in the center, escorts forming a ring 6 kilometers across. The leader's voice cut in again. Target visual. All aircraft prepare for attack run. Descend to attack altitude on my command. Maintain close formation. Select center carrier as primary target. The Zero at the front of the diamond pushed its nose down slightly. The others began to follow. Takeda did not follow. He eased back on his throttle and let the formation pull ahead. The gap opened slowly. 50 meters, 100, 200. The other pilots were focused forward on the target. Nobody looked back. He nosed down and to the right, away from the formation, dropping toward the cloud layer below. The altimeter unwound. 2,800 meters, 2,500, 2,000. His radio came alive. A sharp voice. Takeda's aircraft braking formation. Return to position immediately. He reached down and switched the radio off. The voices cut to silence. At 1,800 meters, he entered the top of the cloud layer. Gray mist surrounded the canopy. Visibility dropped to nothing. He flew on instruments, keeping the nose down, descending through the layer at a shallow angle. Water droplets streaked across the glass. The engine note was steady. The bomb swung slightly under the fuselage. He dropped through the bottom of the clouds at 900 meters. The world reappeared suddenly. Dark water below, scattered whitecaps. Ahead in the distance, the task force was visible again, larger now, the shapes clearer. He leveled off at 800 meters and pushed the throttle forward. Airspeed climbed, 260, 280, 300. The Zero vibrated from the speed and the weight. He aimed the nose directly at the leftmost carrier and began a shallow descent toward the wave tops. Above him and far to his left, the main formation was starting their attack run at 3,000 meters. He could not see them, but he knew what was happening. The American fighters would be diving on them now. The flak would be opening up. The radio would be full of shouts and static. Every gun in the task force would be pointed up at that diamond of planes coming in high and visible and exactly where they were expected. Nobody was looking down at the one aircraft skimming low under the clouds. Takeda flew at 400 meters now, just above the wave tops, heading straight for the carrier's port side. The ship grew larger. He could see details: the island superstructure, anti-aircraft mounts, planes parked on the deck, men moving. At 8 kilometers out, he saw the first flak bursts high above him, black puffs in a grid pattern. The main formation was taking fire. He pushed lower, 300 meters, 200, close enough to see individual waves. The carrier began to turn, slowly. A gentle arc to starboard, angling its deck away from the expected attack from above. The escorts around it were firing upward in coordinated volleys, every barrel elevated, every tracer climbing toward the high formation. Takeda adjusted his course to match the carrier's turn. He was at 6 kilometers now, close enough to hear the distant thunder of guns even through the engine noise. Spray from the waves whipped past the canopy. He held the Zero steady, one hand on the stick, one on the throttle, eyes locked on the ship. At 4 kilometers, he saw the first explosion high above. A Zero turned into a fireball and tumbled out of the sky, trailing black smoke. Then another. The flak was shredding the formation. The fighters were in among them now, red tracers stitching through the diamond. The carrier's deck was huge in front of him. He could see the arresting wires, the catapults, rows of aircraft chained down near the island, fuel lines, ordnance carts. At 2 kilometers, somebody on the ship finally saw him. A 5-inch gun on the port side swung down from its high angle and fired. The shell went wide, hitting the water 300 meters to his left and throwing up a column of white spray. Another gun joined it, then a third. But they were big guns meant for high-altitude targets, and they moved slowly, and he was small and fast and low. He shoved the throttle to the stop. The engine roared, airspeed 320, 340. The Zero shook hard. The bomb created massive drag. The airframe groaned. He did not care. He only needed 30 more seconds. A line of 20-millimeter tracers flashed past his right wing. The lighter guns had found him. He ignored them and held his course. The carrier filled his entire view now. He could see faces on the deck, men pointing, running. At 1 kilometer, he pulled back on the stick and began to climb. Not a steep climb, a shallow rising arc that brought him up from wave-top level to 200 meters, then 400, then 600. The ship's guns tracked him, but he was already inside their minimum range, too close and too low for the big weapons, moving too fast for the small ones. He aimed for a spot just forward of the island where a tight cluster of fighters sat, parked with wings folded and fuel hoses still attached. His angle of approach was almost flat, barely 10 degrees above horizontal. Not a dive, a racing climb that would slam him into the deck at maximum speed. The bomb would go off on impact. The fighters would ignite. The fuel lines would rupture. The fires would spread. At 300 meters out, he saw a man on the deck stop running and look directly at him. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then the man threw himself flat. Takeda's hand hovered over the bomb release. For one heartbeat, he considered dropping it early and trying to pull up, trying to survive. He did not move his hand. The deck rushed up, metal and wood and painted lines. The island loomed to his right. He held the stick steady. At the last instant before impact, he saw movement in the corner of his vision. Another Zero from the high formation had broken through the flak and was diving vertically toward the stern of the carrier, trailing smoke, one wing shredded. The pilot inside was probably already dead or unconscious. The plane fell like a stone and hit the rear of the flight deck in a massive orange fireball. Then Takeda's own aircraft struck. The world became noise and light and pressure. The Zero's nose hit the deck plating at 350 kilometers per hour. The airframe disintegrated instantly. The engine tore free and tumbled forward into the cluster of parked fighters. The bomb fuse triggered. The casing split. 700 kilograms of explosive detonated 15 meters above the deck in a white sphere of expanding pressure. The blast wave tore through the parked aircraft like a hammer. Fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition cooked off, fire spread in a sheet across 40 meters of deck. The explosion punched a hole 4 meters across, straight through the flight deck into the hangar below. Secondary blasts followed as ordnance stored in the hangar ignited. On the bridge of USS Intrepid, the damage control officer grabbed a phone and started shouting orders. Fire parties scrambled, hoses unrolled, foam sprayers activated. Men ran toward the flames with extinguishers and blankets and whatever tools they could carry. In the air above, the remaining Zeros from the high formation were being slaughtered. American fighters tore them apart one by one. Flak continued to burst in tight patterns. 3 more Kamikaze made it through to the task force. 2 hit destroyers and caused moderate damage. 1 missed entirely and plunged into the sea. Within 4 minutes of the first impact, every Zero from the high formation was destroyed. Wreckage floated on the water. Oil slicks spread. Bodies in flight suits drifted face down in the waves. On Intrepid's deck, the fires burned for 18 minutes before they were contained. The hole in the flight deck was temporarily patched with steel plates welded over the gap. 6 aircraft were destroyed completely. 11 more were damaged. 14 men were dead, 23 wounded. But the ship did not sink. Its engines still ran. Its rudder still answered. By late afternoon, it was recovering aircraft again. By the next morning, it resumed flight operations. In the final accounting, 10 had traded itself for 6 enemy planes destroyed, 11 damaged, 14 killed, and 18 minutes of interrupted operations. It was the most effective attack of the entire mission. The pilot who flew it was never identified by name in American records. His aircraft had no markings that survived the impact. His body was not recovered intact. The damage report listed him as unidentified enemy pilot, low altitude approach, unconventional attack profile. Back at the Japanese airfield, the ground crew waited. Noon came. Then afternoon. No planes returned. The radio stayed silent. By evening, the mechanics began preparing the next group of aircraft. They did not speak about the men who had not come back. There was nothing useful to say. In the operations hut, an officer crossed 12 names off a roster and filed a report that stated the mission had achieved its objective. Enemy carrier damaged. All pilots confirmed killed in action, recommended for commendation. He did not mention that 11 of the 12 had been shot down before reaching the target. He did not mention that the one who succeeded had violated orders in broken formation. The report went into a folder with dozens of others just like it. The folder went into a filing cabinet. The war continued. At 11:27 on April 7, 1945, the ground crew at the coastal airfield stood along the edge of the runway and watched the eastern sky. The air smelled of cut grass and engine oil. No one spoke. They had been standing there for 2 hours. By noon, the fuel clerk marked all 12 aircraft as overdue and presumed lost. He closed his logbook and walked back to the supply shed without looking at anyone. The mechanics began draining oil from the reserve engines and checking spark plugs for the next group of planes. Their hands moved efficiently, but their faces were blank. In the operations hut, the duty officer received a coded radio message from Fleet Headquarters. Mission results preliminary. Enemy task force reports 1 carrier damaged by low-altitude attack, fires contained, no operational impact, all other attacks unsuccessful, total friendly losses 12 aircraft, no survivors. The officer copied the message onto a form and filed it in a manila folder already thick with similar reports. He did not read it twice. There was no point. Outside, near the empty revetments, a young mechanic sat on an oil drum and smoked a cigarette down to the filter. He had personally fueled Takeda's Zero that morning. He had checked the bomb rack 3 times to make sure it would not fail. He had watched the plane lift off and disappear into the gray sky. Now it was gone, and 12 others with it, and tomorrow there would be 12 more, and the day after that 12 more, and it would continue until there were no more planes or no more pilots or no more war. He ground the cigarette out under his boot heel and went back to work. 400 kilometers south in a briefing room aboard USS Intrepid, the air intelligence officer stood in front of a group of pilots and showed them photographs of the damage, the hole in the flight deck, the burned aircraft, the scorch marks across 40 meters of steel plating. He pointed at the crater with a wooden stick. This one came in low, under 1,000 feet. We did not see him until he was inside 2 miles. By then, the main battery could not depress fast enough, and the small caliber guns could not track him. He hit the deck at over 300 knots in a flat climb. Unconventional approach, very effective. One of the pilots asked if the attacker had been shot down. The intelligence officer shook his head. He reached the ship. The aircraft disintegrated on impact. We found engine parts and fragments of airframe, but no intact remains. Pilot unidentified. Another pilot asked if this was a new tactic. The officer said it appeared to be individual initiative rather than coordinated doctrine. Most of the other attackers came in at standard altitude and were intercepted as expected. This one broke formation and went low on his own. A third pilot asked if they should expect more attacks like this. The intelligence officer paused before answering. Then he said that based on intercepts and previous patterns, The Japanese command structure did not encourage deviation from planned tactics. Pilots who broke formation were typically considered to have failed in discipline. It was possible this attack succeeded despite orders rather than because of them. The briefing ended. The pilots filed out. The photographs went into a folder marked Combat Analysis. The folder went into a filing cabinet in a locked room 2 decks below the bridge. In the damaged section of the flight deck, repair crews worked through the afternoon welding steel plates over the hole and replacing buckled frame members. By evening, the temporary patch was complete and rated for limited operations. The air boss scheduled a test landing for the following morning. 14 bodies were prepared for burial at sea. Their names were recorded. Their personal effects were collected and tagged for shipment home. The captain held a brief service on the fantail at sunset. Men stood in rows with their caps off. A chaplain read from a small book. One by one, the bodies went over the side wrapped in canvas weighted with shells. The task force continued north. In Tokyo, a staff officer at Combined Fleet Headquarters read the after-action reports from the April 7th mission and made notes in a ledger. 12 aircraft dispatched, 1 carrier reported damaged, fires extinguished within 20 minutes, flight operations resumed same day. 11 aircraft confirmed destroyed by enemy action before reaching target. 1 aircraft reached target and struck successfully. He did not have names for the pilots. The field report listed them by aircraft number only. He did not have details about tactics. The report stated formation attack at altitude 3,000 meters with 1 aircraft separated, cause unknown. The staff officer closed the ledger and filed a summary that said the mission had achieved acceptable results given available resources. He recommended continuing similar operations with emphasis on larger formations to saturate enemy defenses. The summary went to a senior officer who initialed it and passed it up the chain. Nobody asked why 11 pilots had died without effect, while 1 pilot acting alone had done more damage than the rest combined. That kind of question implied criticism of the plan. Criticism of the plan implied doubt. Doubt was not useful. 3 weeks after the mission, a personnel clerk at the coastal airfield received a request from a family in Osaka asking for information about Flight Petty Officer Masaru Takeda, who had not written home since early April. The clerk checked the casualty lists and found Takeda's name under the April 7th mission. Status killed in action. Details classified. He wrote a formal letter to the family stating that their son had died bravely in battle against the enemy and that his sacrifice had contributed to the defense of the homeland. He did not mention that the mission report contained no individual citations. He did not mention that 11 other men had died on the same mission with the same result, which was almost nothing. He signed the letter and put it in the outgoing mail. He had written 43 similar letters that month. The words had stopped meaning anything. In Osaka, Takeda's parents received the letter on a morning in late April. His father read it aloud once in a flat voice. His mother folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with the last letter Takeda had sent them, which said only that he was being transferred and did not know when he would write again. They held no ceremony because there was no body. They placed his photograph on a small shelf and burned incense. Neighbors came and bowed and left. Nobody asked how he had died. Asking implied that it mattered. Takeda's father went back to the hardware shop the next day. His mother swept the floors and prepared meals. Life continued because it had to. In the years after the war ended, researchers tried to piece together the details of the Kamikaze campaigns. They found patrol reports and damage assessments and sortie counts. They found lists of ships hit and aircraft lost and pilots killed. What they did not find was much information about individual tactics. The official records described missions in general terms: formation attacks, high-altitude approaches, standard doctrine. The reports rarely mentioned aircraft that broke formation or pilots who acted independently because those cases were considered aberrations. One researcher found a reference in an American archive to a low-altitude attack on USS Intrepid on April 7, 1945, that caused significant damage. The note described it as unconventional and tactically sound. The attacking pilot was listed as unidentified. The researcher cross-referenced the date with Japanese mission records and found that 12 aircraft had been dispatched that day to attack a carrier group south of Kyushu. 11 were shot down during the approach. 1 struck the target. There were no names attached to the aircraft numbers. There were no after-action interviews because none of the pilots returned. There were no commendations because acknowledging that one pilot succeeded by ignoring orders would have raised uncomfortable questions about why the orders existed. The researcher wrote a paragraph in a book about the attack. He noted that it demonstrated the potential effectiveness of low-altitude approaches, but that such tactics were rarely employed due to the rigid command structure of the Special Attack Corps. The paragraph appeared on page 217 of a book that sold 4,000 copies. Takeda's name did not appear in the book. The researcher never connected the successful low-altitude attack with the young man from Osaka who had wanted to design bridges. In the 1960s, the Japanese government began issuing posthumous commendations to kamikaze pilots as part of a broader effort to honor war dead. Takeda's family received a certificate and a small medal. The citation said he had given his life in service to the nation. It did not mention the specifics of his mission or the fact that his attack had been more effective than 11 others that followed doctrine. His parents were both gone by then. A cousin accepted the medal and placed it in a box with other family items. In the 1980s, a veterans group erected a memorial to Special Attack Corps pilots at the site of the old airfield. The names of all pilots who had launched from that location were inscribed on a stone wall. Takeda's name appeared in a column with 43 others. There was no individual notation, no description of missions, just names and ranks and dates. The memorial stands in a small park, now surrounded by apartment buildings. School groups visit occasionally. A guide explains that these men flew one-way missions against the enemy. Students take photographs and write brief essays about sacrifice and duty. None of them know that one of the names on the wall belonged to a man who succeeded because he refused to follow the plan that killed everyone else. None of them know that his success was buried in reports that could not acknowledge what it implied about the failures. In American naval archives, the intelligence photographs from Intrepid's damage still exist. They show the hole in the deck, the burned planes, the welded patches. The caption reads, "Low-altitude attack unconventional approach pilot unidentified." The two sets of records sit in archives on opposite sides of an ocean. One lists a casualty with no details. The other describes an attack with no name. They are pieces of the same story, but they have never been connected officially. Takeda died at 24 years old doing exactly what he believed would work instead of what he was ordered to do. He destroyed more enemy aircraft in one attack than most pilots managed in entire careers. He proved that the standard doctrine was fatally flawed, and none of it was acknowledged because acknowledging it would have required admitting that 11 other men died following orders that should have been changed. His last decision was made in the cockpit of a Zero at 3,000 meters when he throttled back and let the formation pull ahead. In that moment, he chose effectiveness over obedience. He chose to matter over simply dying in the correct formation. The war did not remember him for it. The records buried him under numbers and reports and classifications. But the fact remains in photographs and damage assessments and repair logs that someone on April 7, 1945, flew lower and smarter and hit harder than anyone else that day. That someone had a name, Masaru Takeda. He wanted to build bridges. Instead, he found the one weakness in an enemy defense that no one else had exploited. And then he disappeared into paperwork and silence.